20?
Abhi 68.
Good afternoon, friends. We are ready at AIIMS. Can we kindly start the VC, please?
Good afternoon. I'm just waiting for the people from the Ministry and Health and Family Welfare to join and start.
Doctor, good afternoon, please.
Good afternoon. I can see you now. So, Lag Agarwal ji, start, please. Please start. We're waiting for
you. Thank you, Doctor. So, at the outset, let me welcome Dr. Randeep Guleria, Director AIIMS. Let me also welcome Dr. Jayalal, National President IMA, Honorary Secretary General IMA, Dr. Lele, and all our colleagues from AIIMS who are helping us coordinate this series of lectures today with the IMA officials and doctors. And most importantly, all the doctor colleagues who have joined today for this video conference. Dear friends, एक बहुत important occasion है हम लोगों के लिए हर तरीके से, क्योंकि पिछले 1.5 साल से हम कोविड की महामारी से जैसे जूझ रहे हैं, उसमें हमने देखा है कि जरूरी है कि जो पहले एक लेवल ऑफ ट्रेनिंग ओरिएंटेशन क्लिनिकल मैनेजमेंट पर हमारे लेवल पर की गई थी, अब उसको और बढ़ाया जाए। जैसे जैसे केसेस अर्बन एरिया से हम रूरल एरिया की तरफ जाते हुए देख रहे हैं, तो बहुत जरूरत होगी कि स्किलिंग और रीस्किलिंग पर हमारा उसी जोर के साथ हमारा कार्य चलता रहे। न्यू एविडेंसेस जैसे जैसे आ रही हैं, न्यू चैलेंजेस जैसे जैसे आ रहे हैं, उसमें हम अपने डॉक्टर फ्रेंड्स को, डॉक्टर कुलीग्स को कैसे ओरिएंट करें, ये दैट इज अ वेरी क्रिटिकल एलिमेंट ऑफ मैनेजमेंट ऑफ कोविड। उसके अप्रोच के तहत ही हम लोगों ने आईएमए से रिक्वेस्ट किया, हमने अपने नेशनल सेंटर ऑफ एक्सीलेंस से रिक्वेस्ट किया, एम्स दिल्ली से जिनकी गाइडेंस में हमारी क्लिनिकल मैनेजमेंट गाइडलाइंस भी बनती हैं, कि हम कुछ स्पेसिफिक टॉपिक्स को लेकर जिस पर काफी ज्यादा भ्रांतियां, काफी ज्यादा डाउट फील्ड पर आए हैं, उस पर एक डिटेल डिस्कशन हो। नेशनल सेंटर ऑफ एक्सीलेंस एम्स के द्वारा ऑलरेडी 10 वेबिनार्स की गई थी अक्रॉस द कंट्री ऑन गाइडिंग विद रिस्पेक्ट टू क्लिनिकल मैनेजमेंट प्रोटोकॉल। सेकेंड सीरीज, ये 4 जो हमने लेक्चर आइडेंटिफाई किए हैं, फर्स्ट लेक्चर वाज ऑन माइल्ड कोविड केसेस, होम आइसोलेशन एंड होम केयर। Second lecture was also on antiviral agents and IL-6 therapy. Today's lecture is about oxygen therapy, ventilation and ICU management. और चौथा lecture इस series में होगा radiology and blood investigation for COVID-19 and its interpretation. In these series of lectures, what our request to all colleagues from IMA, my senior friends who are present here, as well as all doctors who are present here, that this is more like training of trainers. We request particularly IMA National President Saab, that if you can kindly plan a cascading series of trainings beyond this, wherein every state chapter can in turn organize these workshops, these series of clinical management protocol related trainings at field level, that will be a great help considering the trajectory of cases now moving through a wider territory, particularly in semi-urban and rural areas. With these words, let me kindly thank specifically Director AIIMS and Dr. Jayalal for helping us coordinate this event on behalf of Ministry, and I would request Dr. Jayalal for his welcome remarks, please.
Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, it is a great privilege for Indian Medical Association to work with the Ministry of Health. Right from the day one of the COVID, that our medical fraternity is in the front line fighting against the virus, also supporting all the measures of the Government of India taking. Including the vaccination drive or any protocol-based treatment modality. We are fully participating with the Government of India, and in fact, on behalf of the medical fraternity, we would like to thank and compliment our Government of India and Ministry of Health for the exemplary good job they are doing in a difficult situation. What we realize is, whatever you talk about, whether it's oxygen or the drug or the many mission, what is more significant in this is a manpower. So upgradation of their skill and augmenting their knowledge on this is most important job ahead for us when we are expecting the third wave. We have done exemplarily well in the second wave, first wave, but third wave, it is going to be in an unpredictable way. So getting them equipped and empowered to face the third wave is the priority concern. And when this training is done under the auspices of the Government of India, Ministry of Health, and with the support of the AIIMS, it adds a lot of value to that. So we are fully participating with the intention and our commitment to serve the country and to upgrade ourselves to participate with full might and full passion. And we are taking it as a passionate job ahead of us. We dream it is a social responsibility which every doctor has to face. So we have appealed to the government of India. We are thankful to our Shriji Love Agarwal sir for thinking that little more expanding this to make it in a structured training program which is accredited by both the government of India and the AIIMS, so that we will be able to train a large population of our medical fraternity. We have assured minimum 1 lakh doctors community will be trained under this scheme in the continuous days, in the coming days. We are looking forward with great hope and expectation. In the last 2 days, we had a privilege to meet Dr. Guleria and the team. I must salute them for the way in which, the commitment with which they were able to take the questions of our doctors and answer them with the simplicity and the practical oriented way. So we are thankful to you, sir. We continue to assure our support, and we will be working with the ministry and the AIIMS to propagate this vision and knowledge to the people, so that we will be confidently face the challenge which you are going to get in the days. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think, frankly speaking, salute to a whole doctor fraternity for taking this battle head on. And we are all indebted to the doctors community, to all our paramedical community for being such a great help in these trying times. I am also joined by my colleague, Joint Secretary looking after SNS IEC, Dr. Padmaja ji, and with these opening remarks, may I kindly request Dr. Randeep Guleria Saab, Director AIIMS, to take it forward, please. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayalal, President, Indian Medical Association, other colleagues from the Indian Medical Association, Shri Love Agarwal, Dr. Padmaja, other members from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, my own faculty colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd really like to thank IMA for the great work that they're doing, and it's a pleasure to really be part of this activity so that we can really train the trainers and have a wide network of doctors that can be trained across the country, so that we are able to provide quality care for patients suffering from COVID, no matter where they are, in urban area, rural area, in remote areas, and also stay updated in terms of changes that happen as far as treatment is concerned. This is a new viral infection. We're learning about it every day. The virus is changing, new variants are coming, and we're also learning about treatment strategies which keep changing in terms of what works, what doesn't work. And therefore, I think it's very important that we continue these academic activities. And that's why I'm really grateful to the IMA for taking this forward. We at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences have been doing such activities now for almost 18 months. We started off with the EICUs, where we used to have them every Tuesday and Friday. And we've probably interacted with more than 500 hospitals across the country on COVID management. The Center of Excellence program that we started as a mentoring program for each region and for each state, so that they could have state Center of Excellence programs, is also something that we've done. And of course, we also had mentoring for upgrading labs. And we really worked in having various centers, mentoring centers across the country, so that all labs in medical colleges, whether in the private sector or in the government sector, could have the capacity not only for doing RT-PCR testing, but then develop into a molecular testing laboratory, which would be useful even for the coming years as far as diagnostics is concerned. In continuation of that, we are having this Center of Excellence programs in collaboration with IMA. And this is the third of a series of talk. We would love to have feedback from the IMA, and if there's anything else that we can do, it will be our pleasure. Today, we are going to talk on oxygen therapy, ventilation, and ICU management with Professor Vimy Rewari from the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care, and Pain Management will be talking on. And I have an excellent panel, Dr. Anjan Trikha, Dr. Anant Mohan, and Dr. Neeraj Nishchal, who will be there to really answer all the questions once we have the talk. I'm sure this is going to be a really learning lesson, because oxygen therapy is something which is probably the backbone of treatment for moderate to severe COVID. If you really look at oxygen, it is something which is very, very important. In my mind, it's more important than ventilatory therapy. You will save more patients if you are able to give them oxygen properly than you would once you intubate them and put them on a ventilator. Secondly, it's important for us to realize that we've been through a crisis and we have to really see how we can have what we've called an oxygen stewardship program, how we can really optimally use oxygen so that in case there is a surge, we are able to provide oxygen to all those who need it and we don't sort of have wastage of oxygen or leakage of oxygen. So to discuss all of this, I would ask Dr. Vimi to really start her talk, and then we will take the questions, and you can put all your questions on the chat box. And like every time, we will then try and answer all of them. So thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Vimi.
So like I was saying, am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so like I was saying, I'm going to be talking about the mechanisms of hypoxia in COVID-19, the various goals of oxygen therapy, the various kinds of oxygen delivery systems that are available, and I'll talk a bit about invasive mechanical ventilation in the management of non-respiratory organ dysfunction in the ICU. So like I told you, oxygen is essential for all metabolic processes, and the lack of oxygen, otherwise known as hypoxia, affects all organ function, and if not treated in time, can lead to irreversible damage. So hypoxemia is the most common manifestation of COVID-19, and about 14% of patients who are afflicted with COVID-19 present with severe respiratory disease with type 1 respiratory failure, and of these, 5% will require ICU admission. Patients with severe disease who have a respiratory rate of more than 30 per minute, a saturation of less than 93%, lung infiltrates on X-ray of more than 50%, have a very high risk of developing critical illness, more so of developing acute respiratory distress syndrome. So inevitably, they will require hospitalization and often ICU admission as well. 25% of these hospitalized patients will require ICU admission at some point of time. So before we go into the management, I'd like to talk a bit about the mechanism of hypoxia in COVID-19. So in the early part of the disease, there is formation of intravascular microthrombi, and there is intrapulmonary shunting because of some amount of edema and atelectasis. It's not too much. The more amount, the consolidation increases as the disease progresses. In the early phase, it's not as much, and there is loss of lung perfusion regulation. At this point, the patient's respiratory drive is adequate and the compliance is good. So during this phase, the patient's hypoxia is amenable to oxygen therapy alone, conventional oxygen therapy or non-invasive ventilation. As the disease progresses, the lung becomes less compliant. There is increase in dead space. There is formation of edema and there is increased diffusion barrier. So the hypoxia worsens. There is alveolitis, pulmonary edema increases. The consolidation increases. There is formation of new blood vessels or angiogenesis. There is also hypercapnia or retention of carbon dioxide. Patient is very anxious. There is respiratory fatigue sets in. And at this point, the only treatment is to endotracheally intubate the patient and put him on mechanical ventilation. The most common symptoms of respiratory symptoms of COVID-19 are dyspnea, tachypnea, and tightness, feeling of tightness in the chest. And this can be diagnosed by measuring the peripheral oxygen saturation using a pulse oximeter, which is readily available. It is a cheap monitor. It's very easy to use and can be used by anybody. Then the gold standard obviously remains the measurement of the PaO2 or the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood, which can be done using a blood gas analyzer. And this also helps in measuring the PF ratio or the PaO2 by FiO2 ratio, which helps in categorizing the severity of the ARDS, which could be mild, moderate, severe, depending on the PF ratios. If a facility does not have a blood gas analyzer, we can also use another parameter known as the SF ratio or the saturation by FiO2 ratio, which is a very useful and non-invasive marker, and it is known to correlate very well with the PF ratios, as is evident in this slide. In addition to the above, I think a very important thing to look out for or measure is the work of breathing, which we can know by looking at the patient clinically. That is, if the patient is using the accessory muscles of respiration, such as the flaring of the ala nasi, use of the sternocleidomastoid, the retraction of the intercostal muscles, all these tell us that the patient's work of breathing is increasing. And if not treated over time, can lead to respiratory fatigue. So the goal of oxygen therapy here is to maintain adequate tissue oxygenation. So once we administer oxygen, it causes an increase in alveolar and blood levels of oxygen, which leads to correction of the acute hypoxia. And as the hypoxia gets treated, the symptoms associated with the hypoxia, such as feeling of dyspnea and alteration of mental function, also improve. In addition, it also leads to decrease in the cardiopulmonary workload. So what happens is, because of the hypoxia, there is sympathetic stimulation, which leads to peripheral vasoconstriction, which means it increases the afterload. So once you administer oxygen, there is a decrease in afterload, which is beneficial for the left side of the heart. Hypoxia also induces hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, which affects the right side of the heart. So once you administer oxygen, that is abolished, and therefore the load on the right side of the heart is also treated. So when we administer oxygen, what are we looking at? What are the saturation targets that we are looking at? So previously it was thought that higher the better. But now we all know that the saturation target that we should aim for is 92 to 94% if the patient is in the ward. And if the patient is being monitored in the ICU, even 90 to 92% is acceptable. If patient has underlying chronic lung disease such as COPD, then even 88 to 90% is acceptable for these patients. So now there is enough evidence to show that a higher oxygen saturation, more than 96%, does not provide any additional advantage. In fact, it can be more harmful because of the generation of the free oxygen radicals. So now we come to the various delivery devices that are being used to deliver oxygen. And basically of three types. This is the non-invasive devices, which is the conventional oxygen therapy, the high flow nasal oxygenation, and the non-invasive ventilation. So the conventional oxygen therapy devices are basically of two types, which is dependent on the amount of inspired gas flow that the device supplies. So it can be categorized into a high flow system and a low flow system. The high flow system provides all the patient's inspired gas requirement, and therefore the FiO2 remains stable. However, in a low flow system, because the amount of oxygen that is delivered is less, it's not enough to cover for the minute volume of the patient. So the patient draws the remainder of the minute volume from surrounding air, thus diluting that oxygen. So more the minute volume, lower the FiO2. So now we come to the various interfaces which are used to deliver the oxygen. And first we talk about the low flow system. And the most commonly used interface is the nasal cannula, which is capable of delivering an FiO2 ranging from 0.24 to 0.44%. With a flow of 1 to 6 liters. With every increase in 1 liter, there is increase by 4% of FiO2. The main advantage of this device is that it's very easy to use. It is disposable. It doesn't cost much. And it's very easily tolerated by the patient because it allows the patient to eat, drink, cough, and talk while the device is in place. The only disadvantage of this device is that it can cause drying of the nasal mucosa. So the next commonly used device is the simple plastic mask, which is again readily available and easy to apply. The maximum FiO2 achieved by this device is 0.6. And if the total flow of oxygen is kept less than 4 liters per minute, it can cause some amount of rebreathing. Non-rebreathing reservoir mask, I'm sure everybody is aware of this because this has been most widely used in this pandemic. It is a low flow device, but is capable of delivering a very high FiO2. What it comprises of is a mask, which is connected to a reservoir bag, which is about 1 liter in capacity, and it has a one-way valve between the mask and the reservoir bag, which prevents rebreathing of the expired gas. It can deliver FiO2s ranging between 0.8 to 0.95 with an oxygen flow of 10 and 15 liters per minute. So it is capable of delivering a very high FiO2 despite being a low flow device. The only catch here is that you have to ensure that the mask is properly fitting so that there are no leaks around it. And at the same time, when this flow is set at around 10 liters per minute, this reservoir bag is kept inflated at all times, which is an indirect indication of a good fit. Next, we come to the fixed performance systems, which is the prototype of which is the Venturi mask. And it operates on the principle of a gas or oxygen passing through a very small orifice, which entrains air to a predictable dilution. So as you can see, these are the various Venturi devices, which are color-coded according to the FiO2 that it's capable of delivering. And this can be adjusted by changing the valve and setting the appropriate oxygen flow rate. So this is a cross-section of the Venturi device, and you can see that the oxygen passes through a very narrow opening, a jet, and because it comes out under a lot of pressure, and because of this pressure, there is a drop of pressure alongside the jet, which causes entrainment of air through this port. So, and this leads to the dilution of this oxygen as well as increase in the amount of gas flow. So, the larger the port, less the entrainment and higher the FiO2. After the conventional oxygen delivery systems, we talk about another device which is hugely popular during the pandemic, which is called the high frequency nasal oxygenation, high flow nasal oxygenation system, and the prototype of which is shown here. It consists of an oxygen flow meter which is attached to a blender and is capable of delivering FiO2s ranging from 0.21 to 100%. And after it generates a gas flow, it passes it through a humidifier which warms and humidifies the air and passes it through the inspiratory tubing and delivers it to the patient through a nasal interface, which consists of very soft and pliable nasal cannulae. So how do you apply this high flow nasal cannula? You fit the nasal prongs into the patient's nostrils and tighten the back strap. And then you initiate the maximum flow, which could be 60 liters or 80 liters, depending on the make of the device. And after initiating the flow, you place the surgical mask over the cannula. This is an attempt to reduce the aerosol dispersion, which can occur during this therapy. Then you adjust the FiO2 as per the oxygenation level and change the temperature according to the patient's tolerance level. You can start with 37 degrees centigrade and come down. So the main advantages of HFNC is that it is capable of delivering heated, humidified gas at a very high flow and a high FiO2 as well. Besides this, there are other physiological advantages that it has. Because of the high flow, it flushes the nasopharynx with oxygen, which improves the oxygenation as well as reduces the dead space. Also, the high flow kind of generates an extrinsic peak of about 4 to 6 centimeters of water by causing an expiratory impedance. And this in turn lowers the respiratory rate as well as reduces the work of breathing. Also, heating and humidification of gases preserves the mucociliary clearance, and this helps in clearance of the respiratory secretions. The patient is able to clear the airways of the respiratory secretions in a much better manner. So when this device is in place, one has to monitor the saturation and apply a pulse oximeter continuously, monitor the respiratory system and the breathing pattern. A very good index for monitoring the efficacy of HFNC is the ROX index, which is the SpO2 by FiO2 divided by the respiratory rate. And it is a very good predictor of HFNC failure. So every half an hour to 2 hours, one should monitor the ROX index and look at the improvement. It should remain more than 4.88. If the ROX index is less than 3.85 at 12 hours, then one should look at endotracheal intubation and institution of mechanical ventilation or upgrading to non-invasive ventilation, whichever is appropriate for that patient. The hazard of this device is that sometimes if not monitored properly, it can lead to delay in intubation, which can cause respiratory complications and affect the clinical outcome of the patient. So then we come to the non-invasive ventilation, which is the application of positive pressure to the airway using a device which could either be a ventilator or a standalone device using an interface. And I will talk about the interfaces a little later. So this is basically of two types, a CPAP, which is continuous positive airway pressure, which is applied throughout the respiratory cycle, and a BiPAP, which comprises of two entities. One is the EPAP and one is the IPAP. EPAP is the expiratory positive airway pressure, and these can be different. EPAP can be different from IPAP, and EPAP keeps the alveoli partially inflated, which increases the lung volume and the functional residual capacity. And this helps in improving the alveolar gas exchange and the oxygenation. The IPAP, also known as the pressure support, actually helps in augmenting tidal volume and supports the inspiratory effort. So this is very efficient if the patient has hypercapnia, because it helps in clearing the excessive carbon dioxide and also reduces the work of breathing. So now we talk about the various interfaces that are available for instituting the non-invasive ventilation. And the first and the most commonly used is the full face mask. That means it covers both the nose as well as the mouth. The The advantage of NIV is only achieved, the full advantage is only achieved if the seal is absolutely tight, there is no leak, because it operates on the principle of applying positive pressure. So the main disadvantage of this mask is that because it has to be very tight, the patient is very uncomfortable and most often claustrophobic. It can also cause skin damage on the nose as well as the face. So, and along with it, speaking, eating, coughing, having fluids is very difficult for the patient. So it's not very well tolerated. Then a better upgradation is a nasal mask, where the mask is applied only over the nose and the patient is much more comfortable, and because it allows the patient to speak, drink, good cough can be generated. The only disadvantage is that if the patient keeps the mouth open, there is a lot of air leak and the advantage of positive pressure is lost. So not a very good interface during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we talk about the helmet, which is the most useful interface for application of NIV in COVID-19 patient, because this has the best seal. It causes minimum air leak and it is tolerated very well by the patient. So the advantage is that it does not cause contamination of the environment. So the risk of infection to the healthcare workers is much less. The patient does not have claustrophobia. It is much better tolerated. Sometimes it can cause a discomfort to patient because of the noise that it generates, because it's all around the face. And during the pressure support ventilation mode, it might cause asymptomy at times. Otherwise, it's a very good interface for application of NIV. So for NIV, use a helmet mask if feasible. If not, whatever interface you have is all right to be used. And if you have an ICU ventilator, then preferably use an ICU ventilator, because you can titrate the NIV in a better way. And plus, you can apply a HME filter and a viral filter to prevent contamination of the environment. So always use a filter on the expiratory limb, and you initiate with a CPAP of about 10 centimeters of water, depending on the compliance, and a pressure support of 50. And you titrate both of these, looking at the saturation level, looking at the tidal volume that is generated, and the aim is to reduce the work of breathing and the respiratory rate to less than 20 per minute. So you start with an FiO2 of 1 initially when you start the NIV, and then you titrate it down to maintain a saturation 92 to 94%. So again, the monitoring remains the same, and it is very important here also to do continuous monitoring of saturation, respiratory rate, tidal volume, and breathing pattern, as well as the arterial bed gas analysis. See, the contraindication remain an uncooperative or agitated patient with altered sensorium with inability to protect the airway, because the patient can then aspirate, patient who's hemodynamically unstable or has copious respiratory secretion and is unable to clear them. So all these are contraindications. The adverse effects, I would say, keeping COVID-19 in mind, is the generation of excessive tidal volumes. So what happens in the early phase of this disease is that when the compliance is good, the patient generates large minute volume. So this large minute volume, which is a compensation for the hypoxia, can lead to the stress and strain of the alveoli, which is called self-induced lung injury, or SILI, S-I-L-I, or P-SILI, patient-induced self-induced lung injury. So that can lead to certain complications like pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum and subcutaneous emphysema. So we have to make sure that the NIV that you have applied, the settings are such that they do not lead to increase in tidal volumes, which are already there. So that has to be monitored very carefully. Also, patients who have a PF ratios of less than 150 should not be given NIV, because these are borderline patients. That means that they have severe ARDS or moderate to severe ARDS, and then these patients will often deteriorate and will need endotracheal intubation and mechanical ventilation. So these patients should not be given non-invasive ventilations. So after this, I would like to talk a bit about prone positioning, which is useful both in patients who are on non-invasive modes of oxygen delivery, as well as patients who have invasive mechanical ventilation. So prone positioning is known to treat hypoxia in respiratory failure by increasing the pulmonary compliance, by homogenizing the aeration of the lung, thereby preventing progression of pulmonary inflammation, improving oxygenation. It is also known to decrease mortality in intubated patients with severe ARDS, not COVID ARDS, non-COVID ARDS, known to decrease mortality. That has already been established. In fact, this is the only entity which is known to show some benefit in severe ARDS. Awake prone positioning has been tried in patients with COVID-19. It is a very low risk procedure which is easily implemented. It can improve oxygenation early in the disease, but the only catch here is that we do not have enough data to say that there is benefit of this prone positioning, awake prone positioning. There is definitely increase in saturation while the patient is prone, but as soon as the patient becomes supine, that saturation comes back to the original level. So this has been advocated by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare as well, and they have given out guidelines. And if the patient, when the patient is awake, it is very difficult to maintain a prone position for prolonged periods. So they can alternate between left lateral, right lateral, sitting up, and maintain the prone position as much as is comfortable. So just a brief algorithm to how to institute oxygen therapy in patients with COVID-19. So when a patient comes to you with a saturation less than 92% on room air, and there is no obvious respiratory distress, the first step is to administer oxygen through conventional oxygen therapy devices. So you can administer via nasal cannula at 4 to 6 liters per minute and see and keep a tab on the saturation levels. If the hypoxemia is worsening, then you can probably shift it to a non-rebreathing mask at 10 to 15 liters per minute, depending on the saturation. Now, if the patient in association with hypoxia has mild to moderate respiratory distress and the PF ratio is less than 300 but more than 150, that means moderate ARDS, and as saturation is about 90 to 94% on non-rebreathing mask, that means he or she has significant hypoxia. So then we can think of moving on to non-invasive strategies. HFNC is a preferred modality, especially if the patient does not have associated hypercapnia. However, if the patient has associated hypercapnia or has increased work of breathing and is showing signs of respiratory fatigue, or the patient has underlying COPD, then we would opt for NIV instead of HFNC. Patients who have severe respiratory distress or PF ratios less than 150 or a SF ratio of less than 196, then we do not delay endotracheal intubation. We straight away intubate the patient and put the patient on invasive mechanical ventilation. So the indications of invasive mechanical ventilation, I've already talked about a few, but the main indication is escalating oxygen requirements with no improvement in saturation. And one should look out for rapid deterioration in clinical condition if the patient is not showing any improvement despite a very high flow on HFNC and a high FiO2. If the patient has hypercapnia, which is not coming down, is showing signs of increased work of breathing, which is not being helped by a non-invasive ventilation, patient is developing altered sensorium, is becoming hemodynamically unstable, has increasing levels of shock, or is showing signs of multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. So all these conditions, when any of these conditions are existing, then one should opt for mechanical ventilation, invasive mechanical ventilation. Even non-invasive ventilation is mechanical ventilation, but invasive means when you have an artificial device in the trachea for institution of mechanical ventilation. So just a word about airway management, I feel is important to mention here because endotracheal intubation is an aerosol generating procedure. It is one of the procedures where the aerosols which are generated can infect the healthcare worker. So just a word about that. Airway should be handled only by a person who's skilled in managing the airway or knows how to intubate. He or she should always wear full PPE. One should have, these patients should be pre-oxygenated with a very well-fitting mask so that there is no leak around the mask. It should be 2-person, 2-handed mask ventilation with a VE grip to improve seal. An HFE filter should always be kept between the catheter mount and the circuit, which is being used for oxygenation. One should always ensure full neuromuscular blockade, either using a short-acting agent like succinylcholine or a longer-acting agent like rocuronium. And the reason why we use neuromuscular blockade here is because when we intubate, we put in a tube into the trachea, it generates a lot of cough. So if the patient is paralyzed using agent like succinylcholine, the patient will not generate cough. So the chances of the healthcare worker getting infected is very less. Ideally, one should have a video laryngoscope for tracheal intubation. If not, even a normal laryngoscope can be used. But why a video laryngoscope? First, it is easy because the view is very good. So the intubation is quicker. Also, the distance between the healthcare workers or the patient who's intubating face and the patient's face is increased, because you can intubate keeping your face away. So because you don't need to look into the patient's mouth for intubation. So the chances of infection obviously come down. Then always confirm tracheal intubation using capnography. One should not auscultate the chest to look for the proper positioning of the tube. And always remember, do not disconnect the circuit, because every time you disconnect the circuit, you are at increased risk of contamination. So now we come to the ventilatory management. So whenever you're looking after these patients in the ICU, one should always remember the basic principles of critical care. So the basic principles of critical care for management of any patient with severe respiratory disease is lung protective ventilation. Okay, which means that you are using a tidal volume which is low, that is less than 6, equal to or less than 6 ml per kg, and you are targeting a plateau pressure of less than 30 centimeters of water, or a driving pressure less than 15 centimeters of water. So driving pressure is P plat minus the PEEP that you've said. So depending on the phenotype, so basically for the sake of management, these patients have been divided into 2 phenotypes, which means a phenotype L, which has a high compliance, a low elastance. L is for low elastance. Elastance is opposite of compliance. So low elastance, high compliance in the early stage of the disease. These patients do not tolerate very high PEEP, because like I said, they do not have too much of atelectasis. It's only in the later stages when the consolidation increases, the alveoli become less compliant. So initially it is when type L, this is only for the sake of management of these patients. There's actually no real phenotype. So high compliance, they will do well with a higher, they will not do well with a higher PEEP strategy. So the PEEP should always be kept less than 10 centimeters of water. The other phenotype, which is the phenotype H, where the compliance is low, the elastance is very high, and the total lung weight is very high. Okay, because it is fully consolidated and heavy. So the involvement of the lung is much more in the later phase. So here the patients will have reduced compliance, and these will improve by increasing the PEEP levels. So the PEEP levels can be titrated up using the ARDS NET protocol, which is easily available on the internet and can be used. And in association with this, sometimes you may also need to use neuromuscular blockade, only for the reason that sometimes these patients will have, because of the increased minute volume requirement, they can have large requirements of ventilation, and this can cause dyssynchrony between the patient and the ventilator. So once there is dyssynchrony, the ventilation is not optimal and the patients will have desaturation. Okay, so neuromuscular blockade can either be used as intermittent doses or continuous infusion. Now, when you're using neuromuscular blockade, that means that you are paralyzing a patient, and that means that you also have to take care of the analgesia and sedation. So you can imagine a patient who is otherwise awake and has been paralyzed. If you do not give analgesia and sedation to such a patient, that patient is aware of what is happening, is listening to everything, and is not able to breathe, is not able to talk. So that is the extreme form of discomfort, and these patients will respond with tachycardia, hypertension, which will be very difficult to treat. So these are some of the indications that your analgesia and sedation is not all right. So I'll talk about how to manage the analgesia and sedation, because not only will it take care of the patient's awareness, it will also take care of the ventilation by improving the synchrony between the patient and the ventilator. In addition, something that we use in all our areas patient is a conservative fluid strategy. Please, one should not use excessive fluid administration in these patients, because these patients often have leaky capillaries. So all that fluid is going to leak into the alveoli and worsen the alveolar edema. So in case you have the patient is coming from somewhere else and has been over-transfused, say for treatment of shock, then one should administer some diuretic and take care of the excessive fluid, and will help in treatment of the hypoxia. So how will you manage the analgesia and sedation? So you start first with IV fentanyl, which is a short-acting opioid, and to meet the sedation goals, which means that the patient is adequately sedated with a RASS of -2 to 0. This is just one of the many scales which can be used. It's called Richmond Agitation Sedation Score, which is used to monitor sedation. You can use Ramsay Sedation Score as well. So basic aim is that the patient is comfortable and is not fighting the ventilator, and is allowing us to make a prone position. I'll just talk about the prone position also later on in ventilated patients. So if that is all right, you can start at 1 to 2 microgram per kg per hour and titrate it according to patient's needs. Sometimes they might require as high as 4 to 5 microgram per kg per hour. If that is not enough, then you have to add additional agents like propofol, ketamine, and dexmed. So in our ICU, we generally use either dexmed and propofol if the patient is hemodynamically stable, because these might cause some amount of hypotension. If the patient is already hemodynamically unstable and is on inotropes, then we like to use small amounts of ketamine, which help in augmenting this sedation. So you've done the most optimal ventilation that you can do, and despite that, there is no improvement in PF ratios. PF ratio continue to remain less than 150 millimeters of mercury, despite a high FiO2 and a PEEP and high PEEP as well. So then the next strategy is to institute the prone ventilation. So like I said, prone ventilation is one of the only evidence-based entities which have shown to improve mortality in patients with ARDS. So prone ventilation should be done for at least 12 to 16 hours per day. The optimal timing when to start it and the duration of how long should it be continued is very uncertain. But if the patient is a responder, which means that when the patient is turned from supine to prone position and there is significant improvement in the PF ratio, that means that patient is a responder. Okay, so you can continue proning position daily for 12 to 16 hours and till this improvement in PF ratio is consistent and is stabilized. However, if the patient does not show significant improvement in PF ratio once the patient is made prone, then these patients are labeled as non-responders and there is actually no advantage of continuing the proning. In addition, although there is very little evidence both in non-COVID areas as well as COVID areas of the use of recruitment maneuvers and inhaled pulmonary vasodilators, some centers do use them as a last resort and as a tide-over technique. And inhaled pulmonary vasodilators, generally inhaled nitric oxide or prostaglandins such as epoprostenol have been used, but the effect is not sustained and there's no difference in outcomes. So not many centers use it and many guidelines do not recommend it also. So lastly, if there is persistent hypoxemia and all conservative therapy or conventional therapy has been used and there is no improvement in PF ratio, then extracorporeal membrane oxygenation or ECMO is the last resort, which is used only for potentially reversible acute severe respiratory failure. So the tagline here is potentially reversible. If the patient already has fibrosis on CT chest, then there is absolutely no indication of putting the patient on ECMO. So this is purely a clinical decision, and whether to, depending on the center's expertise on instituting ECMO and what is the experience of the critical care unit in handling these patients, because this technique itself is involved with a lot of complications. And also in literature, there is insufficient data to recommend either for or against use of ECMO, because even patients who have been on ECMO, the mortality is as high as 30 to 50%. So there are no clear guidelines to say that yes, ECMO is going to be helpful in these patients. We are still working on getting the data in this aspect. So besides the respiratory failure, once the patient is in the ICU, we also have to look for the other non-respiratory organ failure. And one of the organs which are most commonly involved is the heart or the cardiovascular system. And here the impairment is often due to the ongoing inflammation, the cytokine storm, thrombosis, vasculitis, etc. And this can be diagnosed using the biomarkers of myocardial injury, such as the elevated levels of troponin, D-dimers, IL-6, NT-proBNP for heart failure, FDPs, and PT. So it can manifest in a multitude of ways. The most common manifestations of myocardial involvement is arrhythmias. So often these patients will have arrhythmias and shock. So shock could be either cardiogenic, right ventricular or left ventricular, or vasoplegic shock with cardiac depression. Otherwise, this patient can also present as acute coronary syndrome, both NSTEMI and STEMI. They can also have heart failure, both with preserved ejection fraction and reduced ejection fraction. So systolic dysfunction, diastolic dysfunction can be a manifestation of COVID-19 myocardial involvement. So how do you manage? First, monitoring. So the most commonly used monitoring technique is transthoracic echocardiography, or if you have a transesophageal, that is also very good. You can use an echocardiogram to monitor the function of the heart. You can use the biomarkers, continuous ECG, or ECG is obviously there. Then you can also use cardiac output monitors. So in the initial stages, when there is hypotension, you might want to look at the fluid status because like I mentioned previously, there are leaky capillaries. So there is movement of fluid from the intravascular compartment. So these patients, a select few, might respond to some boluses of fluid. So you have to use balanced crystalloid solution, boluses of 200 ml, and look at the cardiac output. Okay, so if there is improvement in cardiac output, you might give some amount of fluid based on the improvement and for treatment of hypertension. If not, then you have to look for inotropic support like norepinephrine, vasopressin. And if there is heart failure, then dobutamine is the drug of choice. Then second organ system which is commonly affected is the kidneys, and the mechanism of renal failure here is the cytokine injury, the organ crosstalk. Often the alveolar injury leads to tubular injury as well. Then the systemic effects of infection, that is the sepsis, which can cause renal dysfunction. The conservative management here is the use of diuretics to get rid of the excessive fluid and to treat the consequences of acute kidney injury such as hyperkalemia by using potassium binders or anti-hyperkalemic measures. And the metabolic acidosis can be treated by using continuous infusion of sodium bicarbonate. If not optimally treated by this management, then one has to use renal replacement therapy, which could be in the form of hemodialysis, intermittent hemodialysis, or CRRT, continuous renal replacement therapy, or even SLED, depending on the hemodynamic status of the patient. So the neurological complications in the form of seizures, stroke, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and delirium are common in these patients. I would say not common, but they are not unheard of. And one should keep a high index of suspicion, especially if the patient has been paralyzed and sedated. So because the findings will not be very clear in these patients, especially patients who have been paralyzed, because seizures will not manifest as seizures in these patients. So ideally, one should use short-acting sedatives and analgesics, and one should practice daily interruption of sedation. So every day in the morning, from 6 to 8, you should interrupt all sedation and look for assess the neurocognitive state. So that will tell you about the neurological complication if there are any. And non-pharmacological interventions for treatment of delirium, such as more interaction with the relatives, sleep cycle should be more regularized. So all these things will take care of the delirium if there is one. The next important thing, which is a little confusing, is the thromboprophylaxis. So like we all know, COVID-19 is thromboinflammatory disease, and the incidence of thromboembolic events ranges from 31 to 59% in hospitalized patients. And thrombogenesis could be because of multitude of reasons, like severe endothelial injury, which is the most likely reason, increase in inflammation, suppression of the fibrinolysis, there is decrease in natural anticoagulants, and there is activation of platelets and coagulation factors. So all of these leads to a highly thrombogenic state in these patients. So it is recommended that all these patients put on prophylactic dose of anticoagulation if there is no suspected or documented venous thromboembolism. If there is suspected or documented venous thromboembolism, then that patient has to be put on therapeutic anticoagulation. Okay, so prophylactic dose anticoagulation means the commonly used is low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin, if the renal function is all right, in the dose of 1 milligram per kg OD. Then therapeutic anticoagulation is indicated in patients who have severe COVID-19 and have evidence of sepsis-induced coagulopathy, or have a very high D-dimer value with other biomarkers of severity, and have no contraindication for anticoagulation. So these patients are administered a therapeutic dose of enoxaparin, which is 1 milligram per kg in a BD dose. Okay, in patients who have contraindications for anticoagulation, then one must use non-pharmacological devices like intermittent pneumatic compression. So empirical antibiotics are generally not recommended for uncomplicated COVID-19. However, in intubated patients where you suspect some bacterial superinfection, then one must start the antibiotic based on the local antibiogram. And if you have a problem in making decision both on starting as well as discontinuing the antibiotics, then we can take the help of procalcitonin for that. Then it goes without saying that glycemic control is very important, and poor glycemic control is known to be associated with increased risk of complications. So all these patients need to be monitored very rigorously for blood glucose levels, especially patients who have been on high dose steroids. And they need to be treated, if found to be hyperglycemic, they need to be treated with insulin therapy, continuous IV infusion, and the target blood sugar should be kept between 100 to 150 milligram per deciliter. So to conclude, I would like to say that oxygen therapy, like Dr. Guleria already mentioned, is the mainstay of treatment of COVID-19 as of now, because we do not still have a definite treatment of this viral disease. And oxygen reduces the work of breathing and alleviates the need for ventilators, especially during the surges. And HFNC has emerged to be a very well-tolerated ventilatory assist device with multiple advantages. However, during the surges or waves or so-called waves of COVID-19, the problem is the shortage of oxygen. So during that time, one should use HFNC very carefully. The disadvantage that I did not mention previously was that it uses up a lot of oxygen. The flow of oxygen that is needed for running this is very high. So during that, if you have facing shortage of oxygen, one should use it only in selected patients. Otherwise, HFNC is it's a very good modality for treatment of these patients. Then severe disease, patients who have severe disease will require ICU admission, and one should understand that one should not delay invasive mechanical ventilation for fear of complications, because not intubating them will cause more complications than intubating them. And increasing the oxygenation and providing good organ support is indispensable, and it leads to reduction of mortality. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vimmi, for a very comprehensive coverage of the topic. I think we've highlighted the importance of basically oxygen therapy and the different oxygen delivery devices, both for high flow and low flow, basically which are needed, and we have to really take a call on what should be given when to a patient who is having hypoxemia. And obviously, if you have a patient who's very sick, is critically ill, you will have to look at intubation and mechanical ventilation. And there also the whole issue that ultimately, although we started off with the L and H type of, as far as the classification was concerned, low elastance, high elastance, and the issues of SILI in terms of the high tidal volume, and we do see patients developing pneumothorax, surgical emphysema, and even mediastinal emphysema. But by and large, the treatment strategy would be looking at the ARDS network protocol. So low tidal volume, permissive hypercapnia, and trying to keep your plateau pressure, not allowing the plateau pressure to be very high, less than 30 if possible, would be the treatment strategy. And I think that would be what we've been traditionally doing for all ARDS. After all, this would ultimately behave as an acute lung injury causing ARDS. And the protocols by and large remain the same. But I would again like to stress that majority of your patients will really get away either with just treatment for mild disease, moderate disease, or requiring oxygen up to maybe NIV or high flow nasal cannula. A small percentage will really require mechanical ventilation, and the outcomes obviously are not as good as they are in those whom you don't intubate because of a lot of other things, because these patients are on steroids, many of them have comorbidities, and the chances of complications, including superadded bacterial or fungal infection, are higher. So therefore, try to, although you should know when to intubate. You don't want a patient to crash and then intubate, but you should try to continue to support the patient either with NIV or high flow nasal cannula as much as possible, because often you can get away. And as someone asked yesterday, I think it was, how long can you continue HFNC? It's not, there is no, if the patient is well maintained, you can continue for a long time, for weeks also. And gradually, as the lung heals and patient improves, you may then be able to gradually start decreasing the FiO2 requirement and the oxygen requirement. So since we started a little late, without any delay, I'll ask Rajiv to really address all the questions which are there on the chat box, and we'll try and see if we can answer them.
Thank you, sir. We don't seem to have as many as we normally do. I think the talk was so comprehensive that they've been able to answer many of the things that people may have wanted to ask. But we'll start with what we have to begin with. The first thing is something I have I don't understand at all. Vanessa capsule as a method of NIV.
Anjan, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think, earlier on in the disease, when there was a first surge, each one of us were involved in making those kind of, plastic covers to intubate and all those kind of boxes. So this capsule was initially used, and if you would see international literature from Brazil or European countries coming, there was a huge transparent kind of a box which was from the head end to till about the abdomen of a patient, where you could give some pressure like you do it with a helmet. So this was envisaged to be better than a helmet, because a helmet will cause a bit more claustrophobic kind of a thing. So I have not seen it being used in India, and we were earlier on asked in the first surge of the pandemic whether somebody would want to use it, because there were people willing to donate it to us, but then it didn't really materialize. So these are the kind of devices which basically give you a positive pressure and can remove the aerosol whichever is there from a different pore. So not a very popular thing, came in the first surge, but the basic treatment modality remains the same, NIV or CPAP.
Yeah, and one of the issues was that there was a lot of fear of aerosol generation. One of the fears that was there in the beginning of the pandemic was that when you give NIV and if you give HFNC, there is a lot of aerosol generation, and therefore healthcare workers were reluctant. I remember the early days of the pandemic, there was even a very low threshold for intubation, because people were not wanting to give NIV or give HFNC, because they said this will generate a lot of aerosol. All the healthcare workers in the ICU will be exposed, and we were still learning about this viral infection. At that point in time, a lot of such innovative devices which would also decrease aerosol generation were looked at. But gradually we learned that it's not that if you are properly protected, you don't need to worry. And now we moved on from that area where there was a reluctance to use NIV and HFNC to actually now more and more use of NIV and HFNC. And I think that has really brought down the morbidity and mortality as compared to the early part of the pandemic, where there was a lot of early intubations being done because of fear of aerosol generation linked to use of non-invasive ventilation and HFNC. So I think that's part of it.
Right.
Rajiv, just before you go, I'll just ask the panelists if they have any comments or questions to ask. Please just raise your hand and you can sort of join in as far as the discussion is concerned. This is an interactive session, so we would really like it if you can also interact and give your comments.
Yeah, so there are two raised hands on the panel. Dr. Saksham Sharma.
Yes, thank you, sir. So my question is, in the post-COVID period after recovery, when are various investigations such as repeat chest X-ray or PFT or ECG or 2D echo warranted? Because like many patients complained of chest discomfort, chest pain, and various feeling of congestion in the chest. And what are the possible rehab and conservative measures these patients can take?
Okay, I think this is an issue related to post-COVID sequelae and how do we manage that. Some of it we discussed yesterday, but I'll ask Dr. Anant Mohan to address that, because now most hospitals are really running a post-COVID clinic, and these are common issues in terms of what should we do and what investigations are needed at, let's say, at the time of discharge and on follow-up.
Yeah, so the follow-up investigations are largely governed by the symptoms that the person has at that point of time and also at the time when he was admitted. So there is no set criteria that one should do these investigations at exactly these point of time after being discharged. But if suppose he's having a mild illness and there is no oxygen requirement during the hospitalization, so it all depends when he comes back after recovery, what symptoms. Suppose he's dyspneic or he's having cough and the dyspnea is not going away, then at that point of time, one would like to probably, repeat a radiology if required, do a pulmonary function test if he can do. And that PFT can be a kind of marker of his lung reserve at that point of time. If earlier a CT scan was done which showed some significant changes and even after several weeks, the person is not improving, remains symptomatic, you may like to repeat a CT scan in a very select group of people who remain persistently symptomatic, significantly symptomatic. So these all depends upon his symptoms. Now, if he is having, say, thrombotic phenomenon, or like yesterday we were discussing raised D dimers, inflammatory markers. Now, it is not necessary to always repeat all of them. If we find a declining trend during the time of discharge, then we may repeat them again several weeks later to see that they are not again increasing, that's all. And rehabilitation always is very important, and we have seen it really helps. Any patient, in fact, most patients with moderate or severe disease would benefit from rehabilitation, breathing exercises, and must be offered these. So by and large, there is no set guideline on repeat investigations. They are governed mostly by the symptom the patient has, and so then treatment is given accordingly.
Thanks, Anand. There's another raised hand here, Dr. Harsh Rai. You want to ask your question?
Hello, sir. Sir, my question is that it has been seen that in this wave, there were a lot of patients who presented later on with pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum. So what are the precautions that we can do so that it can be prevented in the third wave or in the upcoming wave?
So I think the issue here is of complications which can happen, and we do see them in our patients in terms of pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum. Maybe Anjan can just touch upon that, and if he would like to really comment on then what we can do to prevent them. Some of it was touched by Dr. Vimy also.
Thank you, sir. I think, yes, we saw many cases of pneumothoraxis, pneumomediastinum, and surgical emphysema during the first phase. In the second phase, we are slightly wiser because a large number of people in the country would have hardly used high flow nasal cannulas and even for NIVs. What you can do to prevent this is that if you're using high flow nasal oxygen devices, see to it that you start with the lowest possible flow rates. I have seen people using 60 liters, 70 liters at time 0, and then you start at FiO2 of 1 with a 60 liter per minute of a flow rate. You basically not achieving anything. If you, as a matter of fact, you may lose a lot of patients because they develop pneumomediastinum and pneumothoraxis. And in our series, which we'll be publishing soon, the onset of pneumothorax or a pneumomediastinum is a bad prognostic sign for sure. Especially, and it happens first in the one lung, then it goes to the second lung, and then bilateral chest drains, and then a patient is not able to maintain saturation. Similarly, when you're using NIVs, we've seen it happening after NIV also. You should be very clear what kind of pressures are you using, and try to see to it that you don't use high pressures, and constant watch and monitoring is essential. See, a lot of ICUs, people will be using PPEs, and some kind of clinical compromise takes place. So one should be on the lookout of having a patient not doing well, desaturating. Pneumothorax should be high suspicion. Use an ultrasound to diagnose it and put in a chest drain. So avoid high flows, avoid high pressures, and have a low threshold of diagnosing these things. And once it has happened, then you should treat it accordingly. You should see to it that chest drain is bubbling and you don't cause any kind of injury while putting in a chest tube. See, at times people have put in chest tubes who were not used to putting in chest tubes, and we have seen and we are aware of patients being shifted to us with bronchopleural fistulas. So if a COVID patient develops a bronchopleural fistula, well, the writing is on the wall and the outcome is again very good. So these are the things you can do to prevent it.
Okay, and I'd just add that along with that, even when the patient has recovered and you're sending the patient home, remember this is a disease which heals slowly. So aggressive physiotherapy even after recovery should not be done. You have patients who come recover, and then in the first few days only they're asked to start doing a lot of deep exercises, aggressive physiotherapy. Sometimes that triggers a pneumothorax even later on. So you should give person some time, 6 to 8 weeks to heal, gradually start some degree of activities. And remember, this is a multi-system disorder. It has a lot of inflammation both in the endothelium and also in the alveoli, which is more peripherally situated. So just be a little bit careful and don't be aggressive as far as rehabilitation is concerned in the first few weeks.
Sir, can I add something, please?
Yes, please.
But also, if the patient has come to you with a very high minute volume and is maybe you detect a small pneumothorax at that point, and you've started treatment and the patient is responding to treatment, then definitely you take all the precautions of preventing very high flows. And sometimes with a small pneumothorax, you may not even need to treat it if the patient is otherwise maintaining saturation. However, if the patient is not showing any signs of improvement despite treatment and continues to generate a very high net volume, which itself is the cause of that pneumomediastinum or pneumothorax or subcutaneous emphysema, then it would be very wise to actually intubate these patients so that you can control the minute ventilation that you're getting. I'm not saying that outcome is how the outcome is going to be, but definitely it is going to prevent further injury to the lung. It's not going to increase the pneumothorax because you're controlling the total amount of tidal volume, you're controlling the plateau pressure. So sometimes in these patients, this therapy might help, especially if the patient is not showing any signs of improvement.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Right. Thank you. So we have a couple of raised hands, but I'm going to take two questions from the chat box first, and then we'll come back to address the raised hands. These two kind of run with what we've just been discussing. So what are the settings that should be used when you initiate NIV, and why is a saturation of more than 96 relatively dangerous?
Okay, I think Vimi discussed that, but Dr. Vimi, you could again address this.
Yes, sir. So saturation of more than 96, like I said, it's been studied in non-COVID ARDS. So what happens is if you give a very high concentration of oxygen or maintain a saturation of more than 96, in the alveoli, it leads to release of free oxygen radicals, which itself can cause alveolar injury and cause worsening of the alveolar edema, which is already pre-existing in these conditions in ARDS. So that is more detrimental. So these studies are basically mostly outcome-based. So they have seen that the overall outcome in terms of mortality has been worse in patients in whom the saturation has been maintained more than 96%. Not only the lung, even the kidney. If you are giving high concentrations of oxygen, the free oxygen radicals will cause a harm in other organs as well. So that is why the outcome in terms of mortality is bad. And what was the settings of NIV? Yes. So settings of NIV, like I said, depends on the baseline oxygen saturation and the level of carbon dioxide. Because you will generally like to start NIV patients who are either not responding to HFNC or have a baseline lung disease like COPD or have increasing levels of carbon dioxide or hypercapnia. So then you would like to initiate some amount of pressure support to augment the tidal volume, because obviously the patient is getting fatigued and is not able to generate that kind of tidal volume to clear the carbon dioxide. But again, this is actually not so straightforward, because despite a high minute volume, you may still have hypoxia, you may still have hypercapnia, because the alveolar capillary membrane is actually damaged. So here, increasing the tidal volumes too much, which are already more, may not give you advantage. So in these conditions, you start with a PEEP of 10. Okay, a PEEP of 10 or a positive peak end expiratory pressure of 10 is reasonable, both for a high compliance lung and a low compliance lung. So you start with a PEEP of 10, and then you look at the tidal volumes without instituting any pressure support or IPAP. And if the tidal volumes are less than 6 to 7 ml per kg, then you institute PEEP of pressure support of 5 centimeters of water, and then you look at the tidal volume. Do not start with a very high tidal volume and then generate very high volume minute ventilation, which can harm the lung. But yes, you start with a PEEP of 10, look at the saturation. If the patient's saturation is picking up, then you can keep the PEEP at 10. If not, you can keep increasing it in increments of 2 centimeters of water, as long as the patient tolerates it in terms of hemodynamic stability. Okay, and if the patient's condition improves, you may go down on the PEEP level and come down to 5 centimeters of water. Or sometimes by decreasing it, the saturation remains the same. If you keep the PEEP at 5 or at 10, the saturation remains the same, then you might as well keep it at 5. Right? So you have to titrate the saturation, you have to look at the blood gas analysis and then titrate these two levels depending on the patient's minute volume, the blood gas analysis, and the patient's work of breathing. The settings on which the patient is most comfortable on, that means the patient is not getting fatigue, is the ideal settings. And then you have the basic problem with NIV in these patients is to prevent generation of high tidal volumes. That is the only thing. Otherwise, it is like any other NIV. And if it is not benefiting by instituting the NIV, then you have to quickly change your strategy, intubate the patient and put the patient on mechanical ventilation.
So I think here there are two issues. One, of course, is the oxygenation. And there is enough data from non-COVID ARDS to suggest that maintaining an oxygen saturation which is high, 96, 98% is associated with higher mortality, and that is extrapolated to the COVID-related ARDS. So this is something that we must, one would always start off with saying that let's give maintain the saturation at 98 or so, because you would say that it is improving tissue oxygenation. But the data actually did not support it, and that is why there is now more data from critical care suggesting that you don't need to maintain such a high saturation. Second, of course, is that you have to be careful about the tidal volume and the PEEP that you're giving, and you will have to titrate it on each patient. You'll have to really individualize it as far as the patient is concerned.
Right, thank you, sir. I think we'll take a couple of questions from the panelists now. Dr. Venkatesh, you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself, please.
Hi, sir. Good evening, sir. This is Dr. Venkatesh from AIIMS Patna. Sir, my question is that what is the role of psychiatric evaluation and counseling as a routine in ICU patients?
Okay, so this is you're talking of ICU psychosis and what you can do as far as supporting that, especially in the background of COVID is concerned. So maybe I'll ask Anjan for his comments, because we've had patients who've had a lot of ICU psychosis and issues, even overuse or sending a lot of messages on their mobile phone to the entire family and other members and creating problems. So maybe Anjan can touch upon that.
Okay.
Thank you.
See, any kind of admission into an intensive care unit exposes a person to develop first an ICU kind of a syndrome, especially in the ICUs which are in India, which don't have French windows, day and night patterns are not followed. One is that. And the second thing is they tend to develop delirium, which is not uncommon. And there have been studies where it has been put up to 70% of ICU patients who have been admitted for more than 48 hours will develop that. So the standard ICU guidelines do mention standard drugs which you could give it for that, from melatonin to quatreprine. So many things have been used. What I suggest and what we tend to follow is that one should try to talk to a patient, and you'll have to find out whether he's going into some kind of delirium or depression or ICU syndrome, so that you could have a regular treatment started. And at our setup, we have a psychiatry team consisting of a faculty member and a couple of residents who are there at a phone call away, and maybe they are in various teams of ICUs, so we can take their help and they can talk with the patients. What we decided to do was, because we were not allowing patients' relatives to come in to ICU, they were allowed to take their mobiles inside because they could talk to the patient, to their relatives. So this is a problem which Dr. Guleria was trying to tell you. We've had patients who've gone into delirium and with their mobile phones with them have called all possible relatives at odd hours, their office colleagues, and created a ruckus. That is the flip side of allowing these things. And at the same time, the relative doesn't realize that the patient has had delirium, and it is in that state of delirium he or she is phoning up his relatives or office colleagues. They think that the delirium never occurred. So the very fact it is so common, it is very worthwhile to have a psychiatric team available. And if it is not available in your system, an intensivist is good enough to diagnose ICU syndrome and delirium and start medications. But you must realize that once you've started medications, it will take some time before the medications start working. It's not like aspirin or a paracetamol. You have headache and you pop in one and you're going to be okay within 4 to 5 hours. The best is to try to avoid it. The best is that involves a good ICU setup also. But if you don't have it, have a psychiatry team, and you have a point. They should be there in all ICUs.
Yes, I think it's very important, because I mean, this is something one would see occasionally, even in before COVID, but it's got really aggravated in COVID because of multiple factors: stress, attendants not being allowed inside, everyone wearing PPEs, and the fear of COVID-19. So you should have a psychiatric team at least available to really to support patients in the ICU.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
There's another raised hand, Dr. Sakshi. You want to ask your question?
Good evening, sir. So my question is that we have seen mucus spores in the shoe covers of a lot of doctors in COVID ICUs. So, sir, what are the procedures of reducing spore transmission in ICU setups, sir?
Okay, so infection control practices in the ICU, whether it be related to shoe covers or PPEs, I can ask Neeraj if he has something to say to that, and then maybe Anjan or Dr. Vimi.
Sir, I will just add to first the delirium question aspect. That one thing we sometimes tend to miss in such patient is substance abuse, history of substance abuse. Many of these patients may have history of basically alcohol intake on everyday basis. And once they are in ICU, these type of things may actually flare up, which may cause problem. And in fact, we had few patients who actually had alcohol withdrawal, and because of that, this delirious behavior and everything can persist. So we have to keep that in mind as well, the substance abuse part. And regarding hospital infection control practices, COVID or non-COVID area, one has to ensure. That's why we always ask to wear coveralls, gowns, and shoe cover, and even head caps before entering ICU area, because that's something. And these are disposable things. Once you use it, you dispose it off. You don't wear it outside and then come inside the ICU. So these practices have to be followed by everyone. Whether it's a class 4 employee or a senior faculty, everybody should be following these rules. And these are because these spores are so ubiquitous, you cannot, in a way, unless you are very careful, you will definitely bring them to your ICU setting. And there, of course, patients are immunocompromised and every sort of patients, and they will be at risk. So this practice has to be there basically as a hospital policy, as an institute policy, and not just for an individual person only.
Should I or should yes. What I want to add here is that Neeraj has rightly said, and what has happened now is that earlier on in the first surge, there was a shortage of PPEs as part of infection control. And what has to be realized by each one of us is that it's the doffing time which is the most crucial time when the spread takes off. So whenever these workshops were held at our place, and I'm sure it would be held at various places, the right way to don and doff and infection control practices, taking off the gloves, double gloves, they have to be taken care of. The other issue is that mucor, it is not only mucor. Mucor would be present on your skin, my skin, and it is all over the atmosphere, that if you could say that. As long as you can prevent it from being transmitted to each other or to the patient, that is what is important. And infection control, because inside, if you're wearing two gloves, either you take out the first glove because hand washing is just impossible in these kind of ICUs. So you take off one glove and wear a second one over it. These kind of things will go a long way to prevent it. It is not only the shoes. The shoe covers are supposed to be discarded the right way, and there is a way you've got to doff off whatever you are wearing. Other thing, what I've seen now in the second surge is a lot of doctors and healthcare workers think that because they are vaccinated, they should not follow infection control things, which they were doing in the right way. We have also advocated coming down a level as far as the PPE is concerned, but that doesn't mean that you stop everything. You have to have a basic HIV kind of a kit, which we have: mask, gown, gloves, shoe covers. But there is no reason to stop everything. So infection control remains very important, and that's the only thing which is going to prevent your mucor spores going from one place to another.
Can I add something, sir?
Yes, please.
So like Dr. Anjan rightly said, Dr. Sakshi, mucor is everywhere. It's everywhere. You cannot stop it from, coming in contact with the patient. So the thing in the ICU is that you do not transmit mucor to the patient in the ICU. Either you have patients with mucormycosis in the ICU, they already have it. Okay, so what you have to treat is the condition which is leading to the invasion of mucormycosis into the patient. That means taking care of the blood sugar. So high glycemic control is very important. Treating the immunosuppression state is important, but it is unlikely that you as a health care worker will transmit that infection to the patient of mucormycosis, because it's everywhere. patients come with that infection. You don't give it to the patient in the ICU per se.
Yeah, so mucor is ubiquitous and it is present all over. I think the important issue here is that the observation that we've had is that during the second wave, especially during this later part, there has been a little bit of a casualness as far as infection control practices are concerned in healthcare workers. It could be related to vaccination. It could be related to feeling that now I've got COVID and therefore now I'm protected. And as is rightly said, you must have a stepwise approach in the donning and doffing area to make sure all steps are followed religiously when you're donning and especially when you're doffing. Samples taken from the doffing area, from the shoe covers, from the various other sites in the doffing area often have shown, if you send that sample for RT-PCR, they will pick up the virus in that area. So doffing is an area where you have to be very careful that when you doff, you do it in a proper manner so that you are not sort of carrying the infection with you or getting infected there. Very, very important. Anjan wanted to say something, I think.
No, sir, you've already said it. What I just wanted to put across is there is no indication of nursing these patients of mucor in isolated areas. There is a big stigma attached to it that if you have a couple of mucor patients, then you can't have other patients next to them. So this is creating a lot of ruckus, especially in smaller nursing homes or institutions which are around NCR. I've been asked about it many times. So as long as good practices are being maintained, there is no reason that you will have to have an independent cubicle or a room to manage these mucor patients.
Thank you.
Right, sir. So we again have a couple of raised hands, but I'm going to go back to the question and answers on the chat and then come back to the raised hand from the panelists. The couple of questions from the chat box are that what is the role of an early tracheostomy to assist in weaning? And what are the advantages or disadvantages of CPAP versus BiPAP? So let's take the first one, early tracheostomy.
So I think this is an important question because this is an issue which a lot of us have had through various patients. And should we look at early tracheostomy as far as COVID is concerned, or should it be delayed that you may have a patient whom you may be able to extubate? So maybe I'll ask Dr. Vimi and then Anjan further comments on this.
So in the early part of 2020, it was thought that tracheostomy should not be performed in these patients until the patient becomes RT-PCR negative for the fear of aerosol generation. So the thing is that the indication for tracheostomy in these patients remain the same as any other indication. So after 7 days, if you think that you will be not able to extubate this patient and the patient will require prolonged mechanical ventilation, then this patient should be tracheostomized like any other patient on mechanical ventilation. Also, now there is enough data to show that even if there is, and you have rightly said, early tracheostomy does help in early weaning from the ventilator. It helps in a better tracheal toilet. It has numerous advantages. So ideally, if the patient is going to need prolonged ventilation, then one should perform tracheostomy and in a controlled manner. Now, enough studies and enough data is there that both percutaneous tracheostomy as well as surgical tracheostomy is absolutely safe without fear of infecting the healthcare workers. So they should be performed as early as after 7 days. If the patient fulfills the criteria for tracheostomy, one should go ahead and do a tracheostomy.
What I have to say is that, well, our practices changed over the last 18 months. There were certain concerns of doing tracheostomies in the last surge in the month of April, May and June last year because of various issues like fogging, a lot of aerosol generation, and percutaneous tracheostomies were not really done. And we were the ones who decided to do all our tracheostomies inside the OT. And we had done in the first surge all our tracheostomies inside the operation theatre. When did we do it? It all depended upon patient to patient, and there was not one thing which will fit all patients. There is always a gray area where you think a tracheostomy could have been avoided because the patient could have been extubated. There could be interpersonal differences as far as clinical decision is concerned. But yes, there was a small group of patients, and especially the obese ones, where we decided to do tracheostomies early on because we could manage these obese patients with, let's say, truncal obesity if they didn't have a lot of BMI well with tracheostomies. In the second surge, what has happened is we are slightly more confident. We tend to intubate earlier. We tend to, try to manage. We have been able to manage our patients on ventilator better because of the experience we've had. And like what Vimy has said, we would do a tracheostomy between 7 to 10 days if you think the patient is not going to come out. And earlier on, if a patient is obese and he just cannot manage. We also have a group of patients whom we do tracheostomy along with the surgery, and that is happening in the second surge with our ENT colleagues. We've decided that if we have a mucor which has some which requires massive surgery, that would mean about 4 to 6 hours of surgical exploration, maxillectomy. So at time 0, we would request them, and they have agreed to us that we would do a tracheostomy after a ENT surgeon has done his job. That saves us a lot of problems in the post-op, and we are able to get out these patients faster. So the indications remain the same. We've changed in patients of mucor who undergo a lot of major surgery, and otherwise in obese patients we do it early.
Okay, maybe Anand can answer the second question.
What was that? CPAP versus BiPAP?
CPAP versus BiPAP, yeah.
CPAP.
So is that so that is specifically pertaining to COVID itself, or generally the rules which pertain to NIV use in COVID are the same as we consider for any other patient? Dr. Vimy has explained all these settings. Now, by and large, again, this depends upon the ABG and the, what is the ABG requirement of the patient, whether he is hypercapnic also, or whether he is purely hypoxic. If all he needs is a bit of pressure support, and then in that case, a CPAP would suffice. But if it's a patient who's kind of retaining carbon dioxide, maybe some obstructive airway disease is going on along with that, and you need some extra kind of a negative kind of pressure also to help wash out the carbon dioxide, then you will probably prefer a BiPAP. So it all depends upon the type of the patient profile which is there, and what we want to achieve at that point of time. So that will dictate the choice of our non-invasive ventilation.
Okay, we can go on to the next question.
Right. So the next couple of questions, okay, we have a raised hand again. Let's go to Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh. You want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself on the panel, Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh.
You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, we can't hear you. You've unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. My question is, can we get a nebulizer machine from nearby and use bronchodilator in it for, let's say, for the patient who are unable to obtain oxygen cylinder for themselves, and for the patient whose oxygen saturation is getting below 90?
So you're talking of nebulization through an oxygen system. So
yes,
you could use a jet nebulizer rather than ultrasonic, but a jet nebulizer with an oxygen port can be used. Anand could probably take that up from the point of view of nebulization in patients who have low oxygen and need oxygen through a cylinder.
Yes, sir. So nebulizer can be used. Again, there are one or two things. One, of course, the availability. A jet nebulizer, if available, would be useful for administering pure oxygen and can be connected to an oxygen source. One thing I'd like to add over here is, suppose you are giving a person inhaled the budesonide. So now a lot of budesonide is being given. So a budesonide ideally should not be given along with the ultrasonic nebulizer. That is something that is being advocated. And unfortunately, most of the hospitals now are having ultrasonic nebulizers, including ours, and we tend to use budesonide respules in that. But that is not supposed to be done. So that is just something that can be kept looked at. But for pure oxygen purpose, one can, if possible, better to use a jet nebulizer for administering oxygen or supplementation.
Can I just clarify, did I misunderstand you? Are you saying that can you replace oxygen cylinder with a nebulizer? That was not your question. That was the question. So I kind of understand that's what he wants to ask. If you don't have oxygen cylinders, you don't have an oxygen source, can you use a nebulizer?
Yes, sir.
So
you can't replace.
The jet nebulizer is a drug delivery system, where a nebulizer is a drug delivery system which can give drug to the person. like you have a meter dose inhaler, a dry powder inhaler, and a nebulizer. And you can use any of those as a drug delivery system. It could be a bronchodilator, it could be a steroids, it could be an anticholinergic drug. But it is not an oxygen delivery device. Whereas your oxygen cylinder is an oxygen delivery device, which you can use using a nasal cannula, a venti mask, or a non-rebreathing mask. So those are two different things. A nebulizer cannot be used as an oxygen delivery device. It does not deliver oxygen. It just uses a method of nebulization to generate aerosols, which are drugs. It can be using an ultrasound mechanism. It can be using the jet mechanism of causing the Venturi effect, causing the drug to become an aerosol.
So that means he was saying that whether we can use a nebulizer instead of an oxygen cylinder.
Yes.
No, that we can't do. That we can't do. No.
I think Anjan also wants to clarify something.
Yeah, this question I think has come up because there was a WhatsApp going around in social media where one of the residents, or I don't know who the person was shown that the saturation went up if they used a normal device without oxygen as a nebulizer and giving maybe whatever they were trying to give, but they just refused to realize that the amount of oxygen which was given through that nebulizer without the drug was continued to be 21%. It was not really improving any much. So you cannot replace, like Sir has already said, an oxygen cylinder by a simple machine which just decreases the drop size to various levels and think that you can increase oxygen.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Dr. Prachi Garg has also raised her hand.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, thanks for this educating all of us. And I have two questions to ask. A role of domiciliary oxygen in third wave, number one. Number two, an elderly person with history of pulmonary embolism, how can we end on high flow nasal oxygen? How can we assess de novo pulmonary embolism in that person?
Okay, so the first question I think is the use of long-term oxygen therapy, which we've been probably using in the past for, let's say, COPD and ILD. You want to know whether that can also...
No, sir.
Yes.
So I'm just asking, if the third wave is there, how can we use domiciliary oxygen to the patient who is who are getting affected in third wave, if there is no bed available?
Let's hope we don't have that situation, that we don't have a bed available.
So we are preparing for rural India.
No, I agree with you that we don't know what the future holds, but I hope that we don't have that situation. Maybe I can ask Neeraj if he has, we can answer that question as to what could be the criteria. We had some criteria which came out even during the second wave in terms of home oxygen therapy, either using a cylinder or using a concentrator. But I think we need to be very careful in such patients, because if they deteriorate, and I personally feel there has been some increased mortality because of over-reliance of oxygen at home and patient saturation coming in the night in 80s or 70s, and then they're rushing to the hospital in a severe hypoxemic state. So I think we have to be very careful when we advise home oxygen therapy. But I do agree with you, if you have a shortage of beds, you will have to look at what you can do. So Neeraj, your comments on that?
So definitely oxygen is one of the therapeutic options which these patients will require. Apart from that, they will be requiring multiple other factors, the drugs, the other type of supportive care, which may not be possible at home. So just oxygen is not going to save their lives. And if the other drugs are not being given properly, then that can also cause problems. So we may have to devise a plan even for rural India, where community centers, where at least a trained doctor or trained healthcare professional is there who can take care of all these aspects. So rather than supplying oxygen cylinders or concentrators at individual homes, it would be better if we have a center at village level where all these concentrator or oxygen supply is there, where at least even one single healthcare professional is there to take care of all these aspects. Otherwise, I don't think we should be promoting domiciliary oxygen, even if it is third wave and we might have shortage of bed. We have to plan accordingly.
Yes, so I would agree with that, because I think it's important to have a holistic view, and it would be proper if we put all the oxygen concentrators or cylinders in one, let's say, a primary health center or an area where you could have a healthcare worker to monitor patients and then be able to take a call and have a networking or use telemedicine to stay in touch with the district hospital or let's say a medical college, so that if the patient is not improving, you can transfer the patient to that place for better care. So some sort of a networking and connectivity will have to be done from rural to, let's say, a district hospital or to a medical college, because like we said, majority of patients may not need it and just need supportive treatment. But the small number that need to be cared for more in a hospital setting should be picked up early and sent to the hospital rather than late. But I get your point that in case there's an acute shortage and there's a huge surge, then how will we manage that and what should we do? And I think the second question was regarding pulmonary embolism and how do we sort of diagnose that in, I think that was what you wanted to ask.
So patient on HFNC and how do you pick up the pulmonary embolism?
So patient on HFNC and how do you diagnose this patient as well pulmonary embolism?
No, sir. Patient is already a known case of pulmonary embolism with history of pulmonary embolism and has taken 2 doses of Covishield and has also taken baricitinib. I'm just asking about.
This is not all.
Okay, so patient has taken baricitinib, patient has been vaccinated and now has developed pulmonary embolism. So you will have to follow the standard guidelines whether there is...
No, sir, and it is not diagnosed. How do we diagnose pulmonary embolism in that setting?
Oh, okay. So the issue is how do you diagnose pulmonary embolism in a setting like that? It would depend on what facilities you have, right? Either starting from a CT angio, if you can do that, to an echocardiography looking at the right heart, or looking at various parameters. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Anand to really answer that question in terms of, or you want a further clarification? Okay, please go ahead.
So basically, sir,
I have one more, sir, excuse me, sir. Sir, I have one more question. Yesterday it was told, like if patient is on high flow oxygen, CT angio cannot be done.
okay. So coming to your case scenario, which you have shown, that you see the whole thing, whatever be the case scenario, but in any patient, you are saying patient already had pulmonary thrombus. If the patient already had pulmonary thrombus, it depends whether he is on active anticoagulation at that point of time or not, or oral anticoagulation, whatever. If yes, and then he has to continue that if it falls within the realm of his management. Now, how do we diagnose a new pulmonary thrombus over and above an existing pulmonary thrombus? If that is what you are asking, then again, for that you need to have 2 things. One, you'll need to have the criteria for diagnosis of the earlier thrombus. So where was the location of the thrombus? You need to have the CT angios and all available. And then if the person remains refractory hypoxemic, or he develops a DVT again, or after initial improvement, he again deteriorates and desaturates. So again, then or he develops a chest pain or some wedge-shaped opacities on the chest X-ray, then these are criteria where you may think, okay, there may be extension of the previous thrombus, or there may be a new thrombus. So then you would like to maybe investigate accordingly with whatever you have, echo, CT, angio, or whatever. Maybe prothrombotic markers, if they are increasing, they may support the diagnosis in a way. So that is the only way you can kind of diagnose a new or a de novo thrombus in a pre-existing thrombus. So that is one. Now,
thanks, Anand. We are significantly over time, but I do want to allow 2 more people to ask their questions. I'm going to request them to keep it really
before
short.
you do that, I think Anjan wanted to add something.
Okay. I seem to have a frozen screen for Dr. Anjan here.
Anjan, you're muted.
I think I wanted to add this in spite of Rajiv telling me the time, because this classically falls into the history of a celebrity, which we're not going to name. The patient had a history of pulmonary embolism. Patient had taken both Covishields. He had taken baricitinib, and then he diagnosed pulmonary embolism because clinically we first diagnosed pulmonary embolism. The patient was on high flow nasal cannula. Then we did a bedside ultrasound device, which was converted to an echo probe, and the echo machine was bought. The right heart was empty. The left was not beating very well. The left ventricle was empty, and then thrombus in the middle and the lower artery was diagnosed. Patient was cysted for a CTPA with the high flow nasal cannulas, and thrombolysis was done, which was not successful at times and it was not successful. I think we all know what
I know. So I know that. I understand the patient that is being referred to, but that patient had a CT angio and pulmonary embolism was diagnosed based on a CT angio, and we then gave thrombolytic therapy also based on that diagnosis. Okay, we can go on to the next question.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask Dr. Saksham Sharma, and again a request, please don't ask questions about specific patients. Please keep it a generic discussion about management of COVID. Dr. Saksham Sharma.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So I worked in COVID setup in Delhi during the second wave. And what we saw is like, for example, if we compare two patients of the same age and similar profiles, one had a CT severity score of 8 by 25, another had a CT severity score of 18 by 25. But the patient who had the CTSS of 8 was holding saturation around 90%, and the other patient, which had the CTSS of 18, was holding saturation of 97%. So what is exactly the reason behind the clinical dissociation between the radiological and clinical finding? And also, what is the clinical management approach for such cases? Like, is it solely based on the SpO2?
So I think it's very important to understand, and that is why we've been emphasizing that CT scans sometimes tend to really sort of mislead you, and that's not really important because saturation is more important. You may have a person who may show very little finding on CT, but may have a lot of microthrombus leading to a VQ mismatch, and that itself will lead to hypoxemia, which will not be picked up on a non-contrast or a plain CT. Whereas there may be a lot of, and we know that COVID does cause a lot of thrombotic phenomena, and microthrombi in the lung are well demonstrated in patients who are severely hypoxemic. And that's why we give anticoagulants. So just by looking, so a lot of people feel reassured and they say, look, I should be all right because my CT value is only 5 or 6. CT score is only 5 or 6. And yet they are hypoxemic. So your treatment has to be based on the patient and the clinical parameters rather than the radiological picture. And that is the most important thing, that you look at the patient rather than the CT, and then they'll say, no, my CT score is mild, why should I get admitted? When the saturation actually is in its late 80s. So I think it's very important to really look at the patient and clinically and understand that CT only gives us part of the story. It doesn't give you the entire picture. And that is why you need to understand that maybe it's something that's very, very important. Maybe if anyone else wants to add anything to that, then we can sort of, we can add on to that.
So just to, what you said, to simplify it in a more kind of a layman kind of language, the thing is, like said, there is microthrombosis of those capillaries. So what is happening is that the alveoli is being ventilated very nicely. There is no consolidation, there is no edema. So obviously the CT score is going to be low, but the oxygen is not being transferred from the capillary into the alveoli. So obviously the saturation is going to be low. So that is the reason why, even though the CT score is low, the saturation is less, because the blood is unable to transport the oxygen from the alveoli into the capillaries, right?
I will just take the last.
Smoking is something which we have to take into account, and the type of lesions which are there on CT, whether it's GGO or what type of pattern of involvement is that. That also decides what will be the saturation pattern of the patient. But of course, 18 by 25 saturation initial part, I doubt it will be normal, or like 97, 98.
Okay, we can have one last question.
Right, sir. So the last question will again take it from a panelist who's raised his hand, Dr. Dharmendra Vashisht. You want to ask your question?
Hello. Good evening, sir. Sir, how can we manage happy hypoxia at home? And sir, how can we diagnose it early as it to reduce the complications and mortality, as it is mostly asymptomatic?
Okay, so the issue is, of course, the easiest way to diagnose it would be to look at a pulse oximeter and see what the hypoxia is. But I think the issue would be, can you diagnose it if the person doesn't have an oximeter at home?
Yes, sir.
So, Neeraj, would you like to answer that question, or maybe you can ask Anant what his comments are on this? Because we have realized we rely a lot on oximeter, but in rural India, you may not have an oximeter. And if a person doesn't feel breathless, how do we really know that he is hypoxemic and needs to be admitted?
Oh, it's really difficult, sir. But yes, whenever you are almost at the end of first week, one has to be very careful about how that person is behaving. But the happy hypoxia, of course, the patient will definitely have some sort of tachycardia type of thing. Most of the time they have this thing. They may not feel breathless, but the pulse and other things usually tend to rise. So it has to be basically pulse oximeter based and other subtle findings. If patient has persistent fever or these type of things which can actually guide towards that. But I don't have a definitive answer how to basically pick such patients.
So often what I would say is very often you would find when you talk to this patient, they're not able to complete a sentence without pausing, or you can make out that they are a little bit out of breath when they're talking to you in terms of when you talk to them. And sometimes it's important to have the same healthcare worker talking to them daily, and he or she can notice that now they're pausing more in between sentences, and probably they are hypoxemic, but they don't feel they're hypoxic. There's one issue that your oxygen is low and therefore you are pausing in between, but you don't realize it and you don't say that you're getting out of breath and your respiratory rate is not going up. Anand, would you like to say anything?
So one or two subtle symptoms might be that presence of sweating, maybe because of the distinct sweating, even when somebody is not exerting, that may be one subtle sign. Or sometimes that may be a little late sign, but it is mentioned in the literature that there may be blueness of the mucous membrane, maybe the lips or something, which is maybe noticed by the relatives. Apart from that, all the symptoms which have been mentioned are the ones which we have to watch out for.
Sir, as India is has a high incidence of tuberculosis as well, so most of the patient might not be having those symptoms of respiratory disorders. And if not having any kind of oximeter or something, then it's really tough for us to identify the patient.
So it's a challenge, and that's why he said we have to look for subtle signs, which could be pause in breathing, or saying that they get a little out of breath when they come back from the toilet or when they are climbing a flight of stairs. So even if you look at the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare website, they have given what you can do in terms of home monitoring, even if a pulse oximeter is not available, in terms of breathlessness, respiratory rate, and if you're getting out of breath, on doing a little bit of exertion, like coming out from the toilet or walking a little bit or climbing a flight of stairs. So all of these things you can ask the patient also, and then based on that take a call, but have a low index of suspicion, and therefore if you feel there is something, then you must try and see if you can monitor the saturation with the pulse oximeter.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. I think we really need to come to a close now. We're at 5 o'clock. We allowed a little extra time because we had a few technical issues in the beginning. So maybe you'd like to wind up now, sir.
So before I wind up, maybe I can ask both if Dr. Jailal is there, if you would like to say something, and then Dr. Padmaja from the ministry and for her comments. So Dr. Jailal, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think indeed it is a very, very informative seminar. We are very thankful to you for taking that time. We assure you tomorrow we will have a more number of people will be participating. I just talked with all the state president and secretaries, and there will be a lot of people will be joining. I feel a little upset today. There is number of people joined, is little less, but we will make it up tomorrow. Definitely we will make more people participating, and we will continue this. The cascading effect also we will be working on that. Thank you very much, sir, for all the good things we are able to get.
Thank you, Dr. Padmaja.
Dr. Guleria, sir, thank you so much for this extremely interesting, meaningful learning experience. I would like to thank Dr. Bimi Devari also for her presentation on oxygen therapy, the panelists, yet again, Dr. Anjantrika, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish Suneja, Dr. Neeraj Nischal, and Dr. Rajiv Kumar, as well as the panelists from IMA. I would also like to thank Dr. Jailal and Dr. Jayesh Lele, who were with us earlier at the ministry itself, sir. It's been a very, very informative session, and I hope our doctors from IMA can take it forward in the next set of trainings, cascade trainings as they do it. Thank you so much.
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you. I think what is important, like you rightly said, is that it should have a cascading effect, and this should later on be sort of training of trainers, and you should be able to take it up to, let's say, the grassroots level, so that we're able to provide quality care to all patients, no matter where they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be back again.